They took the truck. They took $46,000. They took his hunting rifles off the wall and split them like Christmas presents. And they left her the house. Nobody wanted it, they said. A sagging farmhouse. A cellar bricked shut for no reason anyone could name. Let Mama have the house, Curtis said. Nobody else wants it anyway. Denise didn't argue. Denise never argued with her brother. Not once in 31 years. She wasn't about to start over a house with a leaning porch, a mildew in the walls. Nora said thank you. She meant it too. That was who she was. She carried the deed home in her lap, like it might bruise. 3 months later, she picked up a hammer. She swung it at a wall her husband built with his own hands, 6 months before he died, for a reason he never gave her. Under that wall was a number so big, the county recorder read it out loud twice, just to be sure he wasn't misreading his own paperwork. But before the hammer, there was the kitchen table. Curtis set his father's hunting rifles on the kitchen table, like a man dividing up a yard sale. He told his mother she could keep the house. Nobody else wanted it, he said. Nora Kessler was 60 years old. She had been a widow for 9 days. She stood at the stove, half turned away, pouring coffee into the same 3 mugs she'd used every Sunday for 30 years. She didn't say a word while her son laid his father's 3 rifles on the oilcloth, like inventory. The Winchester's worth something, Curtis said. He was 34, broad through the shoulders like Walter used to be. He had a way of talking that made every sentence sound already decided. I looked it up. 1600, maybe more if the stock's original. It's original, Nora said. Your father never touched that stock. Right. Curtis didn't look up. So, 1600. Denise, you want the 22, or cash for your half? Denise Kessler Pratt was 31. She had her mother's chin and her father's habit of studying a room before she spoke in it. She'd driven up from Lynchburg the morning after the funeral. Her car still smelled like the dealership her husband Ray had just lost. 9 years he'd poured into that franchise. It pulled out and left him holding $200,000 of debt, with his name on it. Cash, Denise said. I don't need a gun, fine. Curtis wrote a number on a legal pad. He'd brought a legal pad to his father's kitchen table 9 days after the funeral. Nora watched him unpack it from his briefcase. She kept the same calm she'd used her whole life to keep from screaming. The truck went to Curtis. The savings account went next. $46,200. Walter built it penny by penny, over 4 decades of hauling hay and fixing other men's tractors on the side, split down the middle, $23,100 each. The rifles got divided by value on the legal pad, like a spreadsheet with feelings attached. And then the house. You keep the house, Mama, Curtis said. He said it like a gift, like he was handing her something, not setting down the one thing neither of them wanted to carry. It's not worth much. Roof needs work. Cellar's bricked up for God knows why. Back 40's more rock than dirt. But it's paid off. You won't owe anybody anything. Nora set the coffee mugs down, one in front of each of them, the way she'd done every Sunday of their childhood. Thank you, she said. That was all. Thank you. She didn't ask why the house, the one thing that held 38 years of her life, was the last item on a legal pad, priced at nothing, because nobody bothered to price it at all. She didn't ask why her son had already decided, before the coffee was even poured, exactly what belonged to who. She just said thank you. She went back to the stove. She didn't let either of them see her face. Curtis left with the truck loaded before dark. Denise left an hour later. She hugged her mother stiff at the door, said something about calling soon. They both knew the calls had been getting shorter for 2 years, ever since Ray's dealership started bleeding money, ever since Denise stopped saying numbers out loud. Nora stood on the porch until the taillights were gone. Then she went inside. She sat at the kitchen table where her husband's rifles had been laid out like items at an estate sale. She cried for exactly 4 minutes, by the clock on the stove. That was the only grief she allowed herself. There was still a fire to bank, chickens to shut in for the night. Walter Kessler died 5 months earlier, in the spring. A heart that had been failing quiet for 2 years, until it stopped being quiet about it. He went in his sleep, in the bed they'd shared for 38 years. Nora woke at 5 that morning, the way she always did. She reached over. She knew before she opened her eyes. She didn't talk about it much. She didn't talk about most things much. That wasn't new. Millbrook Hollow had never once heard Nora Kessler raise her voice. Not the year Hale took half their tobacco in one afternoon. Not the summer Curtis wrecked his father's truck at 17 and waited 3 days to admit it. What the town did know, from the feed store to the little Baptist church, was different. Nora kept the finest kitchen garden in the county. She could dress a chicken faster than any man in the valley. She had a way of mending things, coats and quarrels and fences alike, that made them last longer than anybody expected. The night her children left with the truck and the money, Nora sat by the wood stove. Walter's old canvas work coat lay across her lap, a needle threaded. She was patching a tear at the elbow that had been there since March. She could have thrown the coat out. It smelled like diesel and cut hay, and something else she couldn't name anymore. Something that was just Walter, fading a little more every week. She patched it anyway. A coat with a story in it keeps a man warmer than a new one, Walter used to say. She'd rolled her eyes at that for 30 years. Now she sat there, his needle and thread logic running through her hands, like it was the only thing keeping them steady. She had $340 in her checking account, a farmhouse with a leaning porch, a cellar bricked shut for reasons Walter never gave her, 40 acres, mostly pasture, some rock, 6 laying hens, and a debt she didn't know about yet. A small note at the Staunton Bank. Walter took it out the year before he died and never mentioned it to anyone. She didn't know that first night that her son had already told his wife the farmhouse would be condemned within the year, one way or another. The land sold off to whoever wanted the creek frontage. Curtis had done the math already. He counted that money spent, the way a man counts a paycheck before it clears. She didn't know a truck with a company logo on the door had already driven past the end of Cutter's Gap Road twice that week. Slow, the driver studying the fence line like he was memorizing it. She didn't know that 6 months before he died, Walter Kessler spent 4 straight days in the cellar. It was January, so cold the pipes froze twice. A trowel in his hand, and 40 pounds of brick, sealing off a section of the foundation that had stood open, root cellar and all, since his grandfather built the house in 1938. What she carried up the stairs to bed that night, wrapped around her like the coat in her lap, was one sentence. Walter said it the week before he died, so quiet she almost missed it over the hiss of his oxygen machine. "Don't let them tear out the cellar floor before you've swept it, Nora," he'd said. "Your grandmother swept that floor 60 years and never found what was under it." I did. She thought it was the medication talking. She thought a lot of things that last week were the medication talking. The strange half-sentences. The way he'd grip her hand and ask about mineral rights on the back 40. Ask if she remembered where the deed box was. Ask her to promise she wouldn't sell the farm, no matter what anybody told her it was worth. She promised. She would have promised him the moon. She just didn't understand yet. He meant every word of it. Plainly. The way Walter Kessler always meant every plain word he said in 38 years of marriage. The bank called on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the funeral, before Curtis and Denise even finished dividing up their father's tools. A man named Harmon, polite enough, explained that Walter had taken a small note against the equipment shed the year before, $6,000. A payment was due. Did Mrs. Kessler want to discuss her options? Nora called Curtis that evening. She hated asking, from either of them, not after they'd told her the house was worthless and handed it over like a burden. They were doing her a favour, naming out loud. But $6,000 was more than she had, and less than her pride, so she called anyway. "That's what you did when you still had a farm to keep." "I've got enough on my plate right now, Mama," Curtis said. Something in his voice was quick and tight. She'd heard it before. The summer he wrecked the truck and lied about it 3 days before the truth came out sideways. "Can't you sell off some of the equipment?" "You don't need the tractor anymore. I need the tractor for the garden, Curtis. You've got a garden that feeds 2 people. There's one of you now." She let that sit. Outside the kitchen window, the light was going gold over Bell Creek, the way it did most evenings, the way it had for 38 years. She watched it instead of answering right away. Answering right away had never once made a conversation with her son go better. "I'll figure it out," she said, and hung up before he could tell her how. She didn't know why her son sounded like a man with debts pressing on him from somewhere she couldn't see. She'd learn later in a courthouse in Staunton exactly how much Curtis owed. A stranger's lawyer would read the numbers off a page. A boat bought the year before his father died. Exactly how far behind he'd fallen on payments he told no one about. Not his wife. Not his mother. Not even himself, some weeks, judging by how hard he avoided his own bank statements. For now, all Nora knew was the number was small. $6,000. Hers to solve alone. She solved it the only way she knew how. She sold 4 hens' worth of eggs at the Saturday market for 6 straight weeks. She put every dollar in an envelope marked Harmon. She didn't tell either of her children she'd done it that way. Earl Tanner showed up on a Thursday morning in late September. Unannounced. He'd been showing up at the Kessler farm for 40 years, ever since he and Walter were boys chasing catfish out of Bell Creek. He was 71 now, retired from the county surveyor's office a decade back. His hand still moved like a man reading a plumb line, even leaning on a fence post. Figured you could use some help getting that woodpile split before it turns cold, he said. He didn't wait for an answer before he unloaded a maul and a wedge from his truck bed. Nora brought him coffee around 10, the way she always had. They sat on the porch steps while he caught his breath. It was Earl, not Curtis, not Denise, who said Walter's name out loud first, without flinching since the funeral. "Walter ask you anything strange?" "Before the end," Earl said. He was looking toward the tree line, not at her. The way men in that valley talked about things that mattered. "Strange how?" "He came by my place last spring. Asked me about mineral law, whether a man could hold rights to what's under his land, separate from the land itself, even if he sold the surface someday. I told him sure, that's common enough, especially out here since the gas company started sniffing around the ridge. He wrote it all down. Never said why he was asking." Nora set her coffee mug down slower than she meant to. "He never mentioned that to me," she said. "No," Earl said. "I don't imagine he would have. Walter always did his worrying quiet. Did his providing quieter still." She thought about that the rest of the day, turning it over while she fed the hens, hauled water, patched the fence where a fallen limb knocked 2 rails loose. She thought about the cellar door, bricked over last winter. Walter never explained that project. He only said the old stonework was unsafe, and he didn't want her down there anymore. She thought about her grandmother's voice, decades gone now, warning a much younger Nora to mind the cellar steps. Unsafe since before the war. Any war. Take your pick. She thought about 6 words. Your grandmother swept that floor 60 years and never found what was under it. I did. That evening she went through Walter's things for the first time since the funeral. Not out of any plan. The drawer in his nightstand had sat closed 5 months, and she finally had the strength to open it. Inside was his Bible, the one he carried to church every Sunday since before they married. Tucked in the back cover, folded in quarters, was a scrap of paper in his handwriting. Sweep the cellar floor, it said. Nothing else. 4 words in the shaking hand of a man sicker than he ever let on, underlined twice. She sat on the edge of the bed they'd shared for 38 years, holding that scrap of paper. For the first time since the funeral, Nora Kessler let herself wonder, seriously, whether her husband left her something the whole world, including their own children, had already decided didn't exist. Outside, the last of the September light faded gold over Bell Creek. Down at the end of Cutter's Gap Road, a company truck with a logo she didn't recognise slowed as it passed the mailbox. Then kept going. Nora didn't see it. Not that night. But she'd remember later exactly how many times that same truck went by in the weeks since Walter died, and exactly what that meant, once she understood what was sleeping under her own kitchen floor. October came in wet and grey, wood smoke and turned leaves, the whole valley smelling like the end of something. Nora kept the farm running on habit more than money. She fed the hens at dawn. She hauled water to the garden beds, putting them to sleep for winter. She drove Walter's old truck into Staunton every other Tuesday for supplies. She counted change at the register the way she'd counted it as a young bride, 40 years back, before the farm ever turned a real profit. She paid Harmon at the bank in full, 6 weeks running, 4 eggs worth of cash at a time, folded into an envelope, slid across the counter. Not a word said about where it came from. Harmon never asked. He'd done business with the Kesslers since before Curtis was born. Men like Harmon knew better than to ask a widow how she managed. Curtis called once that month. He wanted to know if she'd thought about selling the back 40, the rocky stretch along the ridge, toward the county line. Said he knew a man who might be interested. Said it would take a burden off her. What man? Nora asked. Just a contact. Real estate. What's his name, Curtis? There was a pause on the line. It told her more than any answer would have. "I don't remember off the top of my head, Mama. I'll get you his card." He never got her the card. She didn't bring it up again. But she noticed. She noticed everything on that farm. The way a woman notices a fence post starting to lean before it falls. Her son knew a name. He just didn't want to say it out loud to his own mother. She didn't know yet who that man was. A firm out of Roanoke had been quietly buying land along Bell Creek for 2 years. Options on anything with water frontage. Anything close to what the geologists were calling a promising formation under half the ridge. She didn't know Curtis had already talked twice to a man named Deacon Voss, a land acquisition manager who talked fast and smiled easy. She didn't know Curtis had told him, plainly, that his mother's farm would come available soon enough, once the old house got declared unsafe. She didn't know Curtis had signed anything yet. That would come later. It would come with a number attached. $41,000. A finder's fee, contingent on the sale closing inside 18 months. Money Curtis had already spent in his head on a boat payment 3 months behind and a credit card his wife didn't know about. What Nora did know, in October, was smaller than that. A white pickup kept driving past her mailbox. Bellwood Land Services. The door decal read. 4 times now. She wrote the name on the back of a feed receipt and tucked it in the kitchen drawer. She didn't think much more about it. A woman with 6 hens and a leaning porch had other worries before the first hard freeze. Earl came by most Thursdays that month, splitting wood, mending the coop wire, one whole Saturday up on the roof, retarring a leak that had dripped into the front bedroom since spring. He never asked for money. Nora never offered any she didn't have. She fed him supper every time. Some Thursdays that was the only conversation all week that didn't feel like an obligation. "You ever think about what Walter meant?" Earl said one evening. Chicken and dumplings on the table, rain coming down steady outside, asking me about mineral law. "I think about it most days," Nora admitted. "I found a note in his Bible. 4 words. Sweep the cellar floor." Earl set his fork down. "That's an odd thing for a dying man to write." That's what I thought too, until I remembered what he said the week before. About my grandmother, sweeping that same floor 60 years, never finding what was under it. And he did. That's what he said. Earl went quiet a long moment. He was working something over, the way he used to work a property line dispute, back when he still carried a transit and a set of stakes for a living. "Your grandfather built this house in 38, he said finally. "Walter's daddy inherited it. Then Walter." There was talk way back about a spring on this land that never went dry, even in the worst droughts. Some folks used to say there was more than water under this ridge. Coal, maybe, or something better. Nobody ever proved it out. Not that I heard. You think that's what he meant? I think Walter wasn't a man who wrote 4 words down and underlined them twice, for no reason. Earl pushed his empty plate an inch away. The old habit of a man raised not to ask for seconds, even when he wanted them. "I think if I were you, Nora, I'd take a hard look at that cellar, before the ground freezes solid." She thought about it for 3 more days before she did anything. Not because she doubted Earl. Taking a hammer to something Walter sealed with his own hands felt for a while like undoing the last thing he ever did for her, like losing him twice. It was a Tuesday, cold and clear, when she finally carried the hammer down the cellar stairs herself. Earl offered to come do it for her. She told him no, gently, the way she told most people no, when what she meant was, "This is mine to do." He understood. He always had. The bricked-up section sat where the old root cellar door used to be, a rectangle of fresher mortar against the fieldstone foundation. Easy to spot once you were looking for it, impossible to notice if you weren't. Walter had done careful work, the way he did everything, matching the brick colour to what he'd had on hand from an old shed repair. From 3 feet away, in bad light, you'd think it had always been that way. Nora set the lantern on the dirt floor. The cellar had no working bulb, hadn't for years. She looked at that wall a long moment before she swung the hammer for the first time. The brick gave easier than she expected. Walter had used mortar, but not much of it. Not the professional kind. Just enough to hold the pattern together and keep the wind and the mice out. 3 swings in, a chunk the size of her fist thudded onto the dirt. She kept swinging. Her shoulders ached by the 5th strike. Her hands, 60 years old and not built for this kind of work anymore. Stung where the handle rubbed a blister. She kept going anyway. Stopping now felt worse than finishing. Some stubborn part of her wanted to see this through with her own 2 hands, the part that had outlived her husband and raised 2 children who'd learned to divide her up like property. It took the better part of an hour to open a gap wide enough to climb through. She set the hammer down. She picked the lantern back up. What she found on the other side wasn't a room, not really. It was the old root cellar. 8 feet by 10 maybe. Dirt floor. Fieldstone walls sweating cold, the way cellars always did in November. Empty shelving, where 3 generations of Kesslers once kept preserves and potatoes through the winter. Empty except for one thing. Set into the far wall, at about knee height, was a single fieldstone that didn't sit quite flush with the ones around it. Nora noticed it the way she noticed everything. Slow. Careful. The lantern threw long shadows across the dirt. She knelt down. Her knees complained. She pressed her palm flat against the stone. It gave, not much, just enough. She looked at it a long time before she touched it again. Somewhere above her, the house creaked. The way old houses did when the temperature dropped, settling into itself for the night. She thought about Walter's voice, thin and quiet that last week, telling her to sweep the floor before anyone tore it out. She thought about her grandmother, 60 years of sweeping, never knowing. She didn't pull the stone loose that night. She told herself it was because her hands hurt too much to keep going. That was true enough. It wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was simpler. Once that stone came out, whatever was behind it would be real. As long as it stayed where it was, she still had a little bit of Walter's secret all to herself, unopened. The last thing he'd ever have to tell her. She climbed back up the cellar stairs in the dark, her lantern nearly out of oil. She went to bed without calling Earl, without calling anyone. She lay awake a long time, listening to the house settle, thinking about 4 words underlined twice. The next morning, the white pickup came down Cutter's Gap Road for the 5th time. This time it didn't just slow. It stopped, right at the end of her drive. A man in a canvas jacket got out. He stood looking at her fence line a full minute before he knocked on her door. He introduced himself as Deacon Voss. He said he worked in land acquisition. He said he'd heard through the grapevine that the Kessler place might come available before too long. He wanted to get ahead of things, make her a fair offer, before the market got complicated. "Who told you that?" Nora asked, standing in her own doorway, her hand still faintly sore from the hammer. Voss smiled the way men like that always smiled. Easy, practiced. Word travels in a small valley, Mrs. Kessler. "I just like to be thorough." She didn't invite him in. She told him she wasn't selling, thanked him for stopping by, and closed the door before he could say anything else. But she stood at the window a long time after his truck pulled away, watching the dust settle on Cutter's Gap Road. One question wouldn't shake loose. Word travels in a small valley. But whose word exactly had travelled to a stranger from a land company in Roanoke? About a farmhouse nobody in her own family had bothered to price, just a few weeks before. Denise called on a Sunday afternoon in late October, the first time she'd called just to talk in almost a month. Nora could hear something in her daughter's voice right away, a tightness she recognised because she'd heard it in Curtis too. "How's Ray's shop coming along?" Nora asked. She meant the small repair garage Ray had opened after the dealership collapsed. 3 bays and a used parts counter, something he was trying to build into steady work. "It's fine," Denise said too fast. "Slow this time of year." "Everybody waits till spring to fix their cars. You need anything?" "No, Mama, we're fine." They weren't fine. Nora knew her daughters fine the way she knew a storm front coming over the ridge before the radio ever mentioned it. But she didn't push. Pushing had never once gotten either of her children to tell her the truth, a day sooner than they were ready to. What Nora didn't know was that Ray had put a second mortgage on their house 2 months earlier, $42,000, to keep the garage doors open through a slow season that was looking less like a season and more like a permanent condition. She didn't know Denise had quietly moved her $23,000 from Walter's estate straight into that hole. It was already gone, spent on rent, parts and payroll for 2 mechanics Ray couldn't afford to lose. She also didn't know that Denise had heard the name Bellwood Land Services too. From Curtis, most likely. Denise had done the math herself. If the farm sold, even split 3 ways after Nora took her share, it would be enough to keep the garage doors open another year. Denise hadn't said this to anyone out loud. She'd only thought it, in the particular quiet way people think things they're ashamed of wanting. Nora hung up the phone that Sunday. She stood in her kitchen a long time, looking at the calendar on the wall, at the small red circle around November the 9th, the day the equipment shed note came due again. She went back down to the cellar that evening. She told herself she was only checking on the woodpile, stacked along the near wall to keep dry for winter. Within minutes she was standing in front of the loose fieldstone. The lantern threw her shadow long across the dirt floor. This time she didn't hesitate. She worked her fingers into the gap at the stone's edge and pulled. It came free easier than the brick had, sliding out in one piece and landing with a soft thud in the dirt at her feet. Behind it was a cavity, maybe a foot deep, carved into the foundation itself. Old work. Older than Walter. Older maybe than his father. Inside the cavity sat a metal ammunition box. Army green, paint worn thin at the corners. A small padlock, rusted shut through the hasp. Nora lifted it out with both hands. It was heavier than she expected. Heavy enough that whatever was inside wasn't just paper. She carried it up the stairs into the kitchen. She set it on the table where her children had divided their father's rifles just weeks before. She sat down across from it, the way you'd sit across from a stranger you weren't sure you trusted yet. She called Earl before she opened it. Some things, she decided, a person shouldn't do alone. Not when the doing of it might change everything that came after. Earl arrived within the hour, still in his work clothes. He carried a pair of bolt cutters because Nora had mentioned the padlock over the phone. He set the bolt cutters down on the table next to the box and looked at it a long moment without touching it. "You sure you want me here for this?" he asked. "This is yours, Nora. Walter left it to you." "I want a witness," she said. "Whatever's in there, I don't want to be the only one who ever knew it existed." Earl nodded slowly. That made sense to a man who'd spent his life making sure property lines got recorded, where two or more people could see them. He worked the bolt cutters through the rusted hasp with one hard squeeze, and the padlock fell away onto the oilcloth. Nora lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff and yellow with age, was a folded document, its edges soft from handling, its ink faded but legible. Beneath that sat a smaller envelope. More recent, the paper still crisp. Walter's handwriting on the front, the same shaking script from the note in his Bible. Earl read the older document first, holding it carefully at the edges, his reading glasses pushed low on his nose. He was quiet a long moment, long enough that Nora's hands went still in her lap. "This is a mineral rights deed," he said finally. 1961. Your husband's grandfather filed it. Severed the rights to whatever's under this land from the surface. Deed itself. That means whoever owns the mineral rights owns them separate from whoever owns the dirt on top. Even if the farm gets sold, even if it gets split 6 ways among grandchildren, the mineral rights stay with whoever's named right here. "And who's named?" Earl turned the document toward her, his finger resting under a line of type gone brown with age. "Kessler," he said. "Just Kessler. Passed down the family line, generation to generation. Same as the farm itself would have been, if Walter hadn't done something different with it." Nora opened the smaller envelope next. Inside was a single typed page, dated 8 months before Walter died. A renegotiation with a gas exploration company that had quietly approached him the year before, offering to survey the ridge for a pipeline route. Walter had used a lawyer in Staunton, a man named Foster she'd never once heard him mention. Foster doubled the family's percentage of any future lease payments in exchange for granting survey access. At the bottom of that page was one more line, in Walter's own hand, added after the typed document. Dated the same week he wrote the note in his Bible. To Nora alone it read, "Not to the surface estate. Not to be divided." Earl set the page down on the table like it might crack. "Nora," he said, "do you understand what this means?" "I think I'm starting to," she said, though her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. "It means your husband split the mineral rights off from the farm itself, 12 years ago. On paper, legal and recorded, most likely at the very courthouse where Curtis is fixing to divide up this estate. Whatever's under this ridge, gas, coal, whatever the survey finds, it was never part of what your children inherited. It was never part of what got split at that kitchen table. It's yours. Only yours. It always has been." Nora sat with that for a long moment, the ammunition box open between them, the wood stove ticking as it cooled in the next room. She thought about Curtis handing her the farmhouse like it was worth nothing, a burden he was doing her a favour by naming out loud. She thought about the white pickup, the man named Voss standing at her fence line, asking if she'd thought about selling. He knew, she said quietly. Walter knew this land was worth something to somebody. That's why he asked you about mineral law. That's why he did all this in secret and never told a soul. Not even me. He didn't want it decided before he was gone, Earl said. He wanted you to find it on your own terms, when you were ready. Not have it fought over at his funeral, like everything else got fought over. Nora looked at the deed in her hands. 63 years old, her husband's grandfather's signature at the bottom, brown and faded. Beneath it, 12 years old, her husband's own signature. Beneath that, 5 months old, 4 words in a dying man's careful print. To Nora alone. She didn't cry, not right away. She sat very still, the way she'd learned to sit still through every hard thing life had handed her. She let the weight of it settle in slow, the way cold settles into a cellar in November. What do I do with this? She asked finally. Earl was already reaching for his coat. Tomorrow morning, first thing, we drive to Staunton. We find out what this ground's really worth, and we make sure it's recorded proper, in your name, before anybody with a truck and a company decal comes around here asking questions again. That night, after Earl left, Nora sat alone at the kitchen table. The box lay open in front of her. The oilcloth was folded neatly to one side. The deed and the addendum laid flat where she could see them both, at once. She thought about the 6 weeks of egg money folded into envelopes marked Harmon. She thought about her son's boat payment, her daughter's silence, the man in the canvas jacket, smiling at her doorway like he already knew something she didn't. She thought most of all about Walter, bricking up that wall alone, in a January so cold the pipes froze twice, sick and running out of time, making absolutely sure the one thing that actually mattered would end up exactly where he wanted it. In her name. Not divided. Not sold out from under her by a son with a boat he couldn't afford. Not by a daughter with a garage bleeding money. Not by a company man from Roanoke. One who thought a widow with 6 hens wouldn't notice a truck circling her mailbox 5 times in 6 weeks. She closed the lid gently, the way you'd close a door on a room you weren't finished with yet. She carried it upstairs, to the bedroom she'd shared with Walter for 38 years. She set it on the nightstand on his side of the bed, where it would sit until morning. The Green Street courthouse in Staunton smelled like floor wax and old paper. The same smell Nora remembered from filing Walter's death certificate, 5 months before. Earl walked in ahead of her, boots loud on the marble floor. 30 years of his working life, spent inside buildings just like this one. The recorder's office was a small counter at the end of the hallway. That morning it was staffed by a woman named Patricia Holloway, who'd worked there by Earl's count at least 20 years. She recognised him before he said a word. Earl Tanner. Been a while. Been a while, Earl agreed. Got a title question for you, Pat. Mineral rights, severed off a surface deed back in '61. Kessler property, out on Cudder's Gap Road. Patricia's fingers were already moving across her keyboard. Kessler, she repeated. Give me a minute. It took closer to 15. Nora stood at the counter, the ammunition box tucked under one arm. The deed and the addendum sat inside a manila folder. Earl had insisted on that. Not loose in her purse like a grocery list. She watched Patricia's face while the woman scrolled through old microfilm records. A small furrow appeared between her eyebrows. It didn't go away. Well, Patricia said finally, this is interesting. Interesting how? Nora asked. The 1961 severance is on file. Clean record, no issues. Kessler mineral rights, separate parcel classification from the surface estate. That part's straightforward. Patricia turned the monitor towards her, so Nora could see the faded scan. But there's a second document, 1974, an addendum expanding the boundary of the severed parcel. It covers the adjoining 40 acres your husband's family picked up that same year. I don't see the full addendum in your folder, just the signature page. Nora's stomach dropped an inch. That's all we found. In his cellar. Then you're missing the body of the document, Patricia said. The part that spells out the terms. I can pull the county's microfilm copy right now, if you want to see it. She wanted to see it more than she'd wanted anything in 5 months. Patricia printed the full 1974 addendum on the courthouse's slow, humming printer. She handed the pages across the counter with a practiced calm. The calm of a woman who'd handed over hundreds of documents that changed somebody's life and never once let it show on her face. Earl read it first. The way he'd read the original deed at Nora's kitchen table, glasses low on his nose, lips moving slightly over the legal language, the way they always did when he worked something through carefully. "Nora," he said, "this isn't just the original 40 acres. What do you mean?" "The 74 addendum expands the mineral rights. It covers the adjoining parcel your husband's father bought at auction that same year. 40 more acres along the ridge toward the county line." Earl looked up at her. "That's the same rocky stretch Curtis mentioned wanting to sell. The land he told you a man might be interested in." Nora felt something shift inside her chest. Cold and slow, like a stone settling into water. "He was trying to sell land he doesn't actually own the mineral rights to," she said quietly. "Looks that way." Patricia had clearly been listening despite the paperwork in front of her. She cleared her throat gently. "I probably shouldn't say this, but since we're already looking at the file, there was an inquiry filed on this parcel about 6 weeks ago, a preliminary title search, requested by an attorney's office out of Roanoke, on behalf of a company called Bellwood Land Services." Nora's hands went still on the counter. They were checking who held clear title. "Surface and mineral rights both," Patricia went on. "Standard due diligence. Before a company puts real money behind an option. Whoever requested that search would have seen the same 61 and 74 filings we're looking at right now." "Then they'd have known," Nora said. "They'd have known the mineral rights were mine. Not the estate's. Not Curtis's. Not Denise's. Mine specifically. If their attorney did the work properly, yes, they'd have known." Earl was quiet a moment, turning something over, the way he did. "Which means Voss showing up at your door wasn't about the surface land at all," he said. "He already knew what was under it. He was trying to lock down an option on the surface. Before you figured out you held the real price separately, get you to sign something cheap, thinking you were selling a worthless farmhouse, when what he actually wanted was access to whatever's underneath it." Nora thought about Deacon Voss standing at her door, smiling his easy, practiced smile. "Word travels in a small valley," he'd said. She understood now exactly what kind of word he'd meant. They drove home past noon. The manila folder felt heavier in Nora's lap than it had any physical right to be. Earl didn't say much on the drive. That was its own kind of comfort. A man who understood some silences were meant to be sat in, not filled. It was 2 days later, a Thursday, when Curtis called, sounding different. Lighter. Almost cheerful. In a way that raised the hair on Nora's arms before he'd even finished his first sentence. "Mama, I've got some good news," he said. "That contact I mentioned, the real estate fellow. His company's putting together an offer on the back 40, $60,000, contingent on a clean survey. Technically, the land's still in your name, so I told him I'd talk to you about signing off. But since I'm the one who found the buyer, I figured we'd split it the way we split everything else. I already sent him a letter of intent, my signature on it, just to keep things moving. You'll just need to countersign when the paperwork's ready." Nora sat down slowly at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd once laid out his father's rifles like inventory. "You signed something, Curtis, without asking me first." "It's not binding, Mama. It's just a letter of intent. Standard stuff. Everybody does it this way." His voice had that quick, tight edge again, the one she'd learned to recognize. The sound of a man talking faster than the truth could keep up with. "The company's very professional. Bellwood, they're called. Real reputable outfit out of Roanoke." "Bellwood Land Services," Nora repeated. "That's right. You've heard of them?" She thought about the white pickup, circling her mailbox 5 times in 6 weeks. She thought about Deacon Voss at her door, his easy smile, asking if she'd thought about selling. A title search filed 6 weeks ago. And now her own son, excited on the phone, about a $60,000 offer. On land a company already knew from public record held no mineral value in his name at all. Only in hers. "I've heard of them," she said. "Great, so you'll sign when the paperwork comes." Nora looked at the manila folder on the counter. The 63-year-old deed, the 74 addendum inside it. 4 words in her dead husband's handwriting, resting on top of both. "I'll think about it," she said. She hung up before Curtis could answer. The same way she'd hung up on him weeks before, over a $6,000 note he couldn't be bothered to help with. She sat at the table a long time after that call, turning things over, slow and careful, the way she turned over everything in her life. Her son had signed a letter of intent on land he didn't fully own, to a company that already knew he didn't fully own it. That company was betting on getting the surface cheap, locking down survey access before anybody in the Kessler family understood what was actually underneath their own dirt. Her son had done this, she now understood, not out of greed exactly. Or not only greed, he'd done it because he was drowning quietly. The way Denise was drowning. The way half the people in this valley were probably drowning, in ways nobody mentioned at Sunday dinner. He needed that $60,000, or some version of it, more than he needed to ask his own mother one honest question about what she actually wanted. She thought about calling him back, telling him everything. The deed, the addendum, the box, the 4 words underlined twice. Some tired, worn-down part of her wanted to. She was tired of secrets, tired of watching her children circle a truth they didn't know they were circling, tired of being handed things like burdens instead of gifts. But she thought too of Walter, bricking that wall shut in a January so cold the pipes froze twice. Sick, scared, running out of time. Doing the one thing he could still do to make sure this, at least, ended up exactly where he wanted it. He hadn't trusted the children to handle this news gently, or fairly, or without turning it straight into a fight over who deserved what share. He had trusted her. Only her. So Nora folded her hands on the kitchen table, the way she always had when her mind was made up. She would not tell Curtis anything yet, not until the deed was properly recorded. Filed clean, unbreakable, in her name alone. At the very courthouse where he was already trying to sign away land he'd never owned any real claim to. She called Foster the next morning. The Staunton lawyer, Walter, had used to draw up the 74 addendum, the name Earl found in the old man's careful paperwork. Foster remembered Walter well. He still had a copy of the addendum's full terms in his own files, untouched for 12 years, waiting for exactly this moment to matter again. "Mrs. Kessler," Foster said, his voice carrying the calm of a man who'd seen a great many family estates come apart and get put back together. "Your husband was a careful man. He came to me 12 years ago, told me in almost these words that he didn't trust his children to handle money the way they'd handle land. He wanted something set aside that no argument at a kitchen table could ever touch." "He never told me any of that," Nora said. "No," Foster said. "I don't imagine he told anyone. That was rather the point. He agreed to meet her the following week, to begin confirming the severance and recording it clean, in her name, ahead of anything Curtis's letter of intent might try to complicate." Nora hung up the phone. She stood a long moment in her kitchen, looking out at Bell Creek running low and clear past the fence line. Her husband had spent his last honest months on this earth, quietly building her a door nobody else even knew was there, and some one. Foster's office sat above a shoe repair shop on Beverly Street. 2 rooms and a secretary named June, who'd worked there longer than Foster had practiced law. Nora met him on a Tuesday morning, the manila folder in her lap, Earl beside her, in a chair too small for him. Foster was younger than she expected, maybe 50. He had the careful manner of a man who chose his words like lumber, checking the grain before he set it down. "Your husband came to me in the spring, 12 years back," Foster said, once the coffee was poured. He'd read something in the paper about a family 2 counties over, lost a mineral rights fight after the father died without proper documentation. Scared him, I think. He didn't want that happening here. "He never mentioned it," Nora said again. She'd said it to Earl, to Patricia, to herself more times than she could count. "He asked me not to mention it to anyone, including you." Foster folded his hands on the desk. "You deserve to know something else. Mrs. Kessler." I pushed back on that request, gently. Told him a wife usually ought to know something this big. He said, close to word for word, that if you knew too soon, the children would find out too. One way or another, it would tear the family apart before he was even gone. He wanted you to have it clean. After, when there was nothing left to fight about but a piece of paper already filed. Nora sat with that a long moment. Outside Foster's window, Beverly Street carried on. A delivery truck idled. Two women talked on the sidewalk, coffee cups steaming in the cold. He was protecting me from them, she said finally. Not protecting it from me. That's how I understood it too, Foster said. He walked her through the process that morning, plain and unhurried. The severance was already valid, recorded properly in 1961, and again in 1974. What needed to happen now was a formal confirmation, a new filing that would put the matter beyond argument, especially since a third party, meaning Bellwood, had already sniffed around the title once. There's one more thing you should know, Foster said, and I imagine you won't like hearing it. He pulled a thin file from his desk drawer, one Nora hadn't noticed until he set it down. Your husband updated his will 8 months before he passed. I filed the estate paperwork after his death, same as any lawyer would. But the mineral rights aren't part of the estate. They're separate personal property. They never showed up on the inventory Curtis and Denise saw. They don't know this exists, Nora said. It wasn't a question. They don't know it exists, Foster confirmed. Legally, they have no claim to it. Morally, that's a conversation you'll have to have yourself whenever you're ready. Nora thought about that the whole drive home. Earl quiet beside her, the manila folder, thicker now with Foster's paperwork, riding on the seat between them like a third passenger. She thought about the kitchen table, the legal pad, the rifles laid out like inventory. She thought about her own hollow thank you, the last word she'd said, before her children drove off with everything that could be counted and priced. She was not, she realised, somewhere past the Bell Creek Bridge, angry the way she'd expected to be. She was something quieter than angry, something closer to resolved. November came in hard and early that year. A cold snap dropped temperatures into the 20s, a full 3 weeks before it usually did. The farm settled into the rhythm of a Virginia winter, wood split and stacked, hens shut in early against the dark, the garden beds under their last mulch of the season. Denise called again on a Sunday. This time there was no pretending. Nora could hear it in the first 3 words. Mama, I need to talk to you about something. I'm listening. Ray's behind on the shop payments. Really behind. The bank's talking about calling the note. Denise's voice cracked slightly. The crack of a woman who'd been holding something together with her bare hands for months, finally admitting her grip was slipping. I put my whole share from Daddy's account into it already. It's gone. I don't have anything left to give him. And I don't know what to do. Nora closed her eyes. How much does he need? 18,000, maybe 20, to really get current and breathe a little. And Curtis, have you talked to Curtis? Curtis has his own problems, Denise said. Something in the flat, careful way she said it told Nora her daughter knew more than she was saying. The way children in that family had always known more than they said, right up until they couldn't hide it anymore. What kind of problems, Denise? A long silence on the line. He's behind on the boat, way behind. I think he's been moving money around to cover it. I don't know all the details, Mama, and I don't want to know, but I heard him on the phone with somebody a few weeks back, talking about needing a deal to close fast. Nora looked out her kitchen window at the fence line. Bell Creek ran dark under a grey November sky. She thought about a company called Bellwood Land Services, a letter of intent already signed, a son who needed $60,000, or some version of it, badly enough to sell land he never had clear rights to sell. I have some things to sort out, Nora told her daughter. Give me a little time. Time for what, Mama? Just time, Nora said gently. She meant it kindly, the way she meant almost everything she said to her children, even when they'd given her every reason not to. She hung up and sat at the table a long while. The November light went flat and grey outside. She made a decision she'd been circling for 2 weeks without quite letting herself land on it. She would not simply record the deed and disappear behind it. Quiet, untouched, letting her children keep flailing in depths she now understood, that they didn't know she understood. She would let this play out where it needed to play out, at the courthouse, in front of both of them, on the same public ground where everything else in this family had always gotten decided, for better or for worse. Earl came by 2 days later to help her haul the last of the firewood into the shed before the next cold front rolled through. She told him what she was thinking while they worked, her breath fogging in the cold air. You want them there, Earl said. Not quite a question. When Foster finalises it. I want them to hear it the same way I did, Nora said. All at once. From somebody who isn't me. so nobody can say later I made it up, or exaggerated it, or twisted it to punish them. That's not vengeance you're describing, Nora. No, she agreed. It's not. What is it then? She thought about it a long moment, stacking another split log onto the growing pile, her hands steady despite the cold. It's the truth, finally, in a room where everybody has to sit still and listen to all of it. That's all I want. I'm not looking to take anything from either of them. I just want them to understand what their father actually did. And why. And what it cost him to do it quietly, for 12 years, while they never once thought to ask. Earl nodded slowly, the way he did when something settled into place for him, like a fence post settling into a properly dug hole. Foster can set the meeting for the courthouse, he said. Public record room, same place we pulled the filings. I expect Curtis is going to have plenty to say once he understands his letter of intent isn't worth the paper it's printed on. Let him say it, Nora said. I've been quiet in that family for 38 years. I can afford to sit through one more conversation. That evening after Earl left, Nora went down to the cellar one more time, lantern in hand. She stood in the small stone room where the ammunition box had waited 50 years for her to find it. The gap in the brick wall still stood open, cold air moving through it from somewhere deeper in the foundation. She thought about sealing it back up eventually, once everything at the courthouse was settled and done. But not yet. Not until she'd swept the floor the way Walter asked her to. All those months ago. With her own two hands. One last time. So that whatever came next in that family would come from a room, finally, fully swept clean. Deacon Voss did not give up easily. Nora learned that the hard way the second week of November. A certified letter arrived from Bellwood Land Services. $45,000 for an option on the back 40, twice what the company had first mentioned to Curtis. A clause was buried on the second page, granting Bellwood first right of refusal on any future mineral development. Earl read the letter twice at her kitchen table, his jaw tightening with each pass. They're not just doubling down on the surface land anymore, he said. This clause here, first right of refusal, that's them trying to get a foot in the door. On the mineral rights too, dressed up so plain most folks would sign it without ever asking a lawyer what it means. Would I have understood it if I hadn't already known? Probably not, Earl admitted. It's written to look boring. Boring is how these things get signed. Nora folded the letter carefully and set it aside, in the same drawer where she'd once tucked a feed receipt. Bellwood Land Services scrawled on the back, months before she understood what any of it meant. She did not call Voss back. She let the deadline in his letter pass, quiet and unanswered, the same way she'd let so many things pass that fall, patient in a way that unsettled people who expected an old widow to panic the moment real money entered a conversation. Denise called 2 days after the letter arrived, her voice smaller than Nora had heard it in years. Mama raised supplier call today, said if we don't pay down the account by December, they're cutting off parts credit. That's it for us. No parts, no repairs, no shop. How much do you need to keep the credit open? 9,000. Just to hold them off till after the holidays. Nora sat with the phone against her ear, a long moment. Frost was creeping up the edges of her kitchen window. She thought about the choice in front of her. She could send Denise the money right now, quietly, the way she'd quietly paid Harmon at the bank with egg money nobody else knew about. It would solve one problem for 1 week. It would also mean her daughter kept limping forward the same way she had for 2 years, patched instead of mended, one crisis surviving only long enough to make room for the next one. I'm not going to send you $9,000 today, Denise, Nora said gently but plainly. The silence on the line went sharp. Mama, I don't know what else to do. I know you don't. That's exactly why I'm not sending it. A patch today doesn't fix what's actually wrong with that shop, and you know it as well as I do. What you and Ray need isn't $9,000 to survive till January. You need somebody who understands business to sit down with your books and tell you the truth about what's salvageable and what isn't. We can't afford an accountant on top of everything else. You let me worry about that part, Nora said. Come out to the farm this weekend. Bring the books. I've got a few things to tell you anyway, before Thursday. Denise arrived Saturday morning. The ledgers from Ray's shop sat stacked in a banker's box on the passenger seat. Her face was tight, the exhaustion of a woman who'd been doing math in her head for months, and never once liked the answer. She sat at the kitchen table. The same table. Nora made coffee, For 2 hours they went through every page together. Nora asked the plain, unglamorous questions her own mother had once asked her about the farm's books decades before. Questions about margin, overhead which customers actually paid on time. "You're carrying too much bad debt," Nora said finally, tapping a column of unpaid invoices going back 8 months. "Half these customers were never going to pay you." Denise, "Ray's been doing work on credit for people who don't deserve his credit." "He feels bad turning away regulars," Denise admitted. "Especially the older ones, the ones who've been coming since the dealership days. Feeling bad doesn't keep the lights on. I understand the impulse. I really do. I've fed half this valley for free, at one point or another, over the years. But there's a difference between kindness and letting yourself get taken advantage of. And your husband's crossed that line more than he probably realizes. They worked out a plan that Saturday. Practical. Unglamorous. A payment schedule for the supplier. A hard cut-off on new credit for customers. A short list of debts Ray needed to actually chase down, instead of quietly writing off out of pride or discomfort. It wasn't a solution that solved everything overnight, but it was honest. Nora had learned honesty mattered more than speed. Most quick fixes cost more, in the end, than the problems they were meant to solve. "I still don't understand why you're not just handing us money, Mama," Denise said as she packed the ledgers back into their box that afternoon. "You clearly have some kind of plan. Something's changed. I can feel it, even if you won't say what." "You'll understand everything Thursday," Nora said. "I promise you that. But I'll tell you this much now. Whatever's coming, I want you and your brother to actually be ready to use it well. Not just grateful to have it. There's a difference, and it took me longer than I'd like to admit to understand what that difference really means." Denise studied her mother's face a long moment. The way a daughter studies a parent she's beginning to realize she never fully knew. "You sound like Daddy," she said finally. "He used to say things like that. Half of it sounded like nonsense until years later. And then suddenly it made all the sense in the world. Your father spent his whole life understanding things a little before the rest of us caught up," Nora said. "I'm only now starting to appreciate how much of that I never gave him credit for, while he was alive to hear it." Denise left before dark, hugging her mother longer at the door than she had in months. Nora stood on the porch, watching her taillights disappear down Cutter's Gap Road. The same disappearing lights. But something in the watching felt different now. Back in September, she'd stood in that same spot and cried 4 minutes by the kitchen clock before going back inside to bank the fire. She thought, standing there in the cold, about all the small quiet choices that had brought her to this particular evening. The hammer she'd finally picked up. The stone she'd finally pulled loose. The call she'd finally made to Foster instead of carrying the whole secret alone forever. Each one small on its own. And each one, she understood now, exactly the kind of choice Walter had been quietly betting on her making. The whole 12 years he kept this secret waiting in the dark, for her to be ready. Foster set the meeting for a Thursday morning, the second week of December. The small conference room adjoining the courthouse record office, the same place Patricia Holloway had first pulled the file. He sent letters to Curtis and Denise both, formal, businesslike. A matter concerning their father's estate required their presence. Their mother's attorney would be there to explain. Foster had asked Nora, before drafting the letters, whether she wanted a gentler approach, a phone call instead of a formal notice, a private conversation over supper, softened by familiar surroundings. Nora had thought about it for a full day before answering. "No," she told him finally, "send the letters. My children have spent this whole year deciding things without asking me first. At kitchen tables and over legal pads. Quiet and quick. I want this one thing done properly. On paper." In a room built for exactly this kind of truth. Foster hadn't argued. He'd simply nodded. The way a careful man nods when a client finally sounds entirely sure of herself. He drafted the letters that same afternoon. Curtis called the moment his letter arrived. His voice was tight. The tightness of a man who suspects, without yet knowing why, that ground he thought was solid has started to shift. "Mama, what is this? Why do you have a lawyer sending us letters?" "You'll understand Thursday," Nora said. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got right now, Curtis. I'll see you Thursday." She hung up before he could push further. That was something she'd learned to do all fall. She stood in her kitchen a long moment, listening to the quiet. It had a different sound now than it did right after Walter died. Present, not empty, full of things that hadn't been said yet. Denise called an hour later, quieter, more frightened than angry. "Mama, is everything all right? Are you sick? Is it the farm?" "I'm not sick," Nora said. "The farm's fine. Better than fine, actually. I'll explain everything Thursday, I promise. I need you both there together." Curtis is furious. He thinks you're trying to take something away from him. Nora thought about the letter of intent. $60,000. A company that had already run a title search and already knew exactly what it was buying and what it wasn't. She thought about her son's boat payment, the credit card his wife didn't know about, the particular kind of desperation that makes a man sign something before he understands what he's signing. "I'm not taking anything from your brother that was ever his to begin with," she said. "That's the part he's going to have a hard time hearing." The week before the meeting passed slow and cold. The ground froze hard enough that Nora's boots crunched across the yard each morning on her way to the hen house. Earl came by twice, once just to sit with her over coffee, once to help her go through Walter's remaining papers in the study, a task she'd put off since spring. They found nothing more. No second box, no third document. Only the ordinary paperwork of an ordinary life. Tax returns, equipment receipts, a stack of birthday cards from Curtis and Denise, going back 30 years. The handwriting changed across them, a child's careful block letters, then a teenager's rush scrawl, then an adult's brief, dutiful signature. Nora read every one of those cards that week, coffee going cold beside her at the kitchen table. With every card, she found herself less angry at her children, and more simply sad, for the family they might have been, if money and fear hadn't gotten so tangled up in how they loved each other. "You could still tell them gentler," Earl said one evening, watching her sort the cards into a shoebox. "Call them out here, separate, one at a time. Ease into it." "I thought about that," Nora admitted, "but I keep coming back to the kitchen table. The legal pad. The way Curtis divided everything up like a man settling an estate sale. He never once asked me what I wanted, or whether I minded, or whether any of it mattered to me beyond the dollar figure written next to it. So this is about being heard. It's about them finally sitting still long enough to hear something true, instead of deciding in advance what they think it's going to be." Nora closed the shoebox lid. "I raised 2 children who learned to solve every hard thing in this family with a legal pad and a fast decision. I'd like, just once, for them to sit in a room and let the truth take as long as it needs to." 2 days before the meeting, Curtis called again. A different tone this time. Softer. Almost pleading. "Mama, Bellwood's attorney called me today. Wanted to confirm the survey date on the back 40. I told him everything's on track. He asked me a strange question, though. Wanted to know if I was certain the mineral rights were included in what I was offering to sell. I told him, of course, why wouldn't they be?" He went quiet for a second. Then he said he'd have to check something and call me back. Nora felt her pulse pick up slightly, though her voice stayed even. "Did he call back?" "Not yet. Mama, is there something about the mineral rights I should know?" She could have told him then. Some tired, worn-down part of her wanted to just say it plainly and be done with the waiting. But she thought of Walter, bricking that wall shut in the cold, choosing to let her find it in her own time. She figured she owed her children the same patience her husband had shown her, even if patience, in this case, looked a great deal like withholding. "You'll know everything Thursday," she said. "I promise you that." Curtis was quiet a long moment. When he spoke again, some of his usual certainty was gone. "Mama, if there's something wrong with that letter of intent, I need to know now. I've already told people things are moving forward. I've already made plans around this money." "What kind of plans, Curtis?" Another silence, longer this time. "The kind I can't take back easily," he said finally. Nora understood, without him saying another word, exactly how deep her son had already dug himself in. She thought about telling him to stop, to pull back, to undo whatever he'd already set in motion, before Thursday made the undoing harder. But some things she'd come to believe over 5 months of widowhood, a person had to walk into eyes open, consequences and all, before the lesson would ever actually take. "Thursday," she said again gently, and hung up the phone. It felt like the 100th time that fall, each call a little shorter than the last, each silence growing into something that would either heal or break, once the truth finally came into the open. The night before the meeting, Nora couldn't sleep. She got up past midnight, wrapped herself in Walter's old canvas coat, the one she'd patched back in September. She walked down to the cellar one more time, a lantern in one hand and a broom in the other. She swept the floor, slowly, carefully, the way her grandmother must have swept it, 60 years before, never knowing. The way Walter had wanted her to sweep it, finally at the very end, when he could no longer do it himself. Dust rose in the lantern light, old and fine, decades of it. She worked the broom into every corner of that small stone room, until the dirt floor was as clean as a dirt floor could ever be made. When she finished, she stood a long moment in the middle of the swept floor, the lantern light steady around her. She spoke out loud to the empty cellar, to her dead husband, to the house itself, her voice barely above a whisper. "I swept it, Walter," she said, "just like you asked." Nothing answered her, of course. Nothing ever did. Not in any way she could point to and prove, but something in her chest loosened all the same. Some knot she hadn't fully realised she'd been carrying since the day he died. She climbed the cellar stairs that night lighter than she'd felt in 5 months, ready finally for whatever Thursday was going to bring. Thursday morning came in clear, hard cold. Frost silvered the fence posts along Cutter's Gap Road. The sky over the ridge was the pale, scrubbed blue of a Virginia winter. Nora dressed carefully, a navy dress, the one she'd worn to Walter's funeral, and a few times since. She drove herself into Staunton, the manila folder on the seat beside her. Earl followed in his own truck, a few car lengths back. Curtis was already in the conference room when she arrived, pacing near the window. His suit jacket looked a size too sharp for a Thursday morning meeting about family business. Denise sat at the long table, hands folded tight in her lap, braced for something she couldn't name yet. Foster stood at the head of the table, a folder in front of him. Patricia Holloway had come down from the recorder's office at his request, to stand as a neutral county witness. She waited quietly near the door, a certified copy of the filings in her hands. "Mama," Curtis said, the moment Nora sat down, "I don't understand why we need a county recorder in the room for a family conversation." "Because it isn't only a family conversation," Nora said. "Sit down, Curtis." He sat. Foster opened his folder and began, plain and unhurried, the way he'd explained it to Nora weeks before. He laid out the 1961 severance, the 1974 addendum, the deed passing solely to Nora upon Walter's death, entirely separate from the surface estate Curtis and Denise had already divided at their father's kitchen table. Curtis's face went through several colours while Foster spoke, pale first, then flushed, then pale again. "That's not possible," he said when Foster finished. "The estate inventory didn't list any mineral rights. I saw the whole inventory myself." "The mineral rights were never part of the estate," Foster said. "Your father severed them from the surface deed 12 years ago. Legally, they're a separate parcel entirely. They passed to your mother through a will provision your father filed the same week." "Why would he do that?" Denise asked quietly, the first thing she'd said since Nora walked in. "You'll have to ask your mother that," Foster said. "I can only tell you what the paperwork says. But I'll add this since I'm already in the room. Your father came to me because he worried about exactly this kind of confusion happening after his death. He wanted the matter settled beyond argument, in a way no family dispute could later unwind." Curtis turned to Nora. For a moment she saw something in his face she remembered from long ago, the boy who wrecked his father's truck at 17, and waited 3 days to admit it. A flash of fear underneath the anger. "Mama, I signed a letter of intent," he said. "Bellwood's expecting to close on the back 40. If the mineral rights aren't included, that whole deal falls apart." "I told them it was clean." "It was never clean, Curtis," Nora said. "Bellwood already knew that. Their attorney ran a title search on this property 6 weeks ago. They knew the mineral rights belonged to me, not the estate, before you ever signed anything." The room went very quiet. "What are you saying?" Curtis asked. "I'm saying Deacon Voss wasn't trying to buy your land," Nora said. "He was trying to buy access to what's underneath it. Cheap. From a family that didn't know what it was sitting on. And you handed him exactly the deal he wanted. Because you needed the money badly enough not to ask one careful question first." Curtis's jaw worked. No sound came out for a long moment. "How badly did you need it, Curtis?" Nora asked, gently. Though the gentleness had an edge now it hadn't carried in months. Badly enough to sign a company's paperwork before you understood what you were signing. Badly enough to sell your own mother's mineral rights out from under her on land you thought was worthless 3 months ago. I didn't know, Curtis said. His voice had lost all its earlier certainty. Mama, I swear to you I didn't know any of this existed. I know you didn't, Nora said. That's rather the point. Your father didn't tell you. Because he didn't trust you to handle it without turning it into exactly the kind of fight we're having right now. Denise had gone very still, her eyes fixed on the deed Foster had laid out. How much is it worth? She asked quietly. The mineral rights, what's actually under the ground? Foster glanced at Nora. A silent question. Nora nodded once. The gas company's preliminary survey estimates lease and royalty payments over the next decade at approximately $2.3 million. Foster said, plain as reading a grocery list. Bellwood's own attorney would have seen that figure in the public record. It could move up or down once formal negotiations begin, but that's the working estimate right now. The number hung in the room a long moment. Heavy, strange. The kind of number that makes ordinary furniture look suddenly small around it. Curtis sat down hard in his chair, as if his legs had simply stopped agreeing to hold him up. $2 million, he said, mostly to himself. We split $46,000 at that kitchen table. $46,000. And this was sitting underneath the whole time. Underneath the part you called worthless, Nora said. The part you told me nobody wanted. Nobody spoke for a moment. Patricia Holloway shifted quietly near the door. A woman who'd seen 100 moments like this and knew better than to fill the silence with anything of her own. Mama, Denise said finally, her voice small. I put my whole inheritance into Ray's shop. It's gone. I've been sick about it for weeks. I never once thought to ask how you were managing out here alone. I assumed you had it easier than us. The house paid off. Nothing but yourself to feed. I had $340 the week you two left, Nora said. I sold eggs for 6 weeks straight to pay a note your father left behind. Neither of you offered to help, because neither of you thought there was anything left on this farm worth checking on. Curtis flinched at that. Visibly, the first time in the whole meeting, his composure actually cracked all the way through. What happens now? He asked. With Bellwood. With the letter of intent. Foster answered before Nora could. The letter of intent was never valid to begin with. It purported to convey mineral rights your mother alone holds. Once this is formally recorded, this afternoon, any offer Bellwood makes will have to come to Mrs. Kessler directly, on whatever terms she chooses to negotiate, if she chooses to negotiate at all. And the boat, Curtis said quietly. The payments I'm behind on. I was counting on this deal to cover that. Nora looked at her son a long moment. 34 years old, sharp-shouldered like his father used to be, drowning quietly in debts he'd never once mentioned to the woman who raised him. That's not something I can fix for you today, Curtis, she said. Not by handing over land that was never fully yours to sell. But it's something we can talk about, honestly. Once everybody in this room stops pretending they know what somebody else can afford to lose. Patricia stepped forward then, the certified copy still in her hands. She addressed the room the way a county officer addresses a room. Plain, without ceremony. For the record, the severance of 1961 and the addendum of 1974 are both valid and enforceable as filed. Mrs. Kessler's title to the mineral estate is clear and uncontested. I'll be recording the confirmation this afternoon. That closes the matter, from the county's perspective. She said it simply, no weight of judgment in her voice. A fact, not a verdict, but the words landed in that room like a door closing. A door that had been standing open for 5 months, ever since a son laid 3 rifles on a kitchen table and told his mother the house was hers because nobody else wanted it. Curtis put his head in his hands, briefly. When he looked up again, something in his face had shifted. Not defeated exactly. Smaller, more honest than Nora had seen it in years. I'm sorry, Mama, he said. I should have asked you what you wanted instead of just deciding it for you. Yes, Nora said. You should have. She didn't say it cruelly. She said it the way she said most things, plain and quiet. A fact laid on the table next to all the other facts. She watched her son absorb it. The way a man absorbs something he's known was true for a long time, but never once let himself hear out loud. Denise reached across the table then, an unplanned motion, and put her hand over her mother's. The first time since the funeral. What do you want to do now, Mama? With the land. With all of it. Nora looked at her daughter's hand on hers. She thought of Walter, bricking that wall shut alone in a cold January, trusting her to find her own way to this moment, in her own time, with nobody standing over her telling her what to decide. "I want to go home," she said. "I want to think about it there on my own porch, the way I think about everything. Then I'll tell you both what I've decided, when I've decided it. Not one day before." Curtis almost smiled at that, a small, rueful thing. The first real smile Nora had seen on her son's face, in longer than she could remember. "That sounds like something Dad would have said." "It is something your father would have said," Nora told him. "I've been listening to him longer than either of you have been alive." Nora drove home alone that afternoon. Earl followed again, a few car lengths back, the way he had all morning. She let the quiet of the truck cab settle over her, the whole way down Cutter's Gap Road, past the frost-silvered fences, past the mailbox where a white pickup had once circled 5 times in 6 weeks. Christmas came 2.5 weeks later, quieter than any Christmas Nora could remember. But not an unhappy quiet. Curtis and Denise both came out on the same day this time, an arrangement they hadn't managed since before their father got sick. They brought their families and enough food for twice the number of people actually sitting at the table. Nobody mentioned the letter of intent, or the boat, or the second mortgage, or any of the numbers that had nearly torn the family apart that fall. They talked instead about ordinary things, a grandchild's school play, a broken water heater, whether the hens were laying well enough through the cold snap. Somewhere in the middle of the meal, Nora found herself simply grateful. In a way she hadn't let herself be, in longer than she wanted to admit. After the plates were cleared, Curtis pulled a small wrapped box from his coat and set it in front of her. Inside was a photograph, framed simply. Walter, standing in front of the farmhouse decades earlier, young and sunburned, one hand resting on a fence post he'd set himself. "Sarah found it going through some old boxes at the shop," Curtis said. "Thought you should have it before we lost track of it again." Nora held the frame a long moment, running her thumb along the edge of it. She did not cry, though she came closer to it than she had at the courthouse, closer than she had in months. "Thank you," she said. "This is a better gift than money, Curtis. I hope you know that." "I'm starting to," he said. She did not feel triumphant. She'd expected, somewhere in the back of her mind, that this moment might feel like winning. The way Curtis and Denise always talked about winning, a number on a page, a deal closed. Instead, it felt quieter than that. Heavier too, closer to relief, closer to grief revisited. A door that had been standing open in her chest for 5 months, finally easing shut. Deacon Voss called that evening. His voice was noticeably less easy than it had been at her front door in October. Bellwood's attorneys had already heard exactly how the courthouse meeting went. "Mrs. Kessler, here's where things stand," he said. "We'd still very much like to discuss a lease arrangement. On fair terms whenever you're ready." "I'm not ready today," Nora told him. "I may not be ready for a good while yet. When I am, I'll call the number on your card. Not before." She hung up gently, the way she hung up on most things now. She went back to her supper. Chicken and dumplings. Enough for 2, out of habit more than hunger. She still cooked for a man who wasn't coming to the table anymore. Bellwood's second letter arrived the following week. This time it came with an apology attached. Plain and businesslike. It acknowledged the earlier attempt to secure an option on land. Land the company already knew from its own title search was never fully Curtis's to sell. Nora read it twice at the kitchen table, Earl's coffee mug across from her empty chair. She felt something close to satisfaction, not at the apology itself, at how small the company suddenly looked. Its plain paperwork sitting next to Foster's plain paperwork, the truth simply winning on its own weight. Curtis called 2 days after the meeting, quieter than she'd heard him in years. "I talked to Sarah last night," he said. "Told her everything. The truck, the boat, all of it. She cried and then she got mad. And then this morning she made me call a credit counsellor before I even left for work." "How would that feel?" Nora asked. "Terrifying," Curtis admitted. "And better than I expected. Turns out most of what scared me about telling the truth was just the telling, not the truth itself. Your father learned that lesson exactly once," Nora said. "The hard way. The year of the bad tobacco crop. I'm glad you're learning it a little younger than he did. Curtis's boat sold in January, at his own insistence, before the bank could force the sale on worse terms. He called to tell her. His voice sounded steadier than it had in months, almost embarrassed at how much lighter he felt once the debt was gone, instead of quietly poisoning every decision he made. "I should have told somebody I was drowning," he said, instead of trying to swim quiet, hoping nobody noticed. "That's a family trait," Nora said. "Your father did the same thing, in his own way, just aimed at a better end." The truck followed the boat in February, traded down for something plainer, fully paid for. Curtis mentioned almost sheepishly that he'd started keeping a household budget on a legal pad of his own. This one, he said, had nothing to do with dividing up anybody's inheritance. Denise and Ray restructured the shop's debt that same month. A small business counselor at the Staunton Bank walked them through it, slower than either of them wanted, but steadier in the end. Steadier than the $60,000 Curtis once hoped to hand them from a deal that was never really his to make. Ray, for his part, finally sent collection letters to customers who'd been riding his generosity for years. It cost him 2 old friendships from his dealership days. It also brought in enough to keep the shop's doors open clean through the spring. Nora signed her own lease agreement with the gas company in February. A fair one this time, negotiated by Foster on terms that made even Earl whistle low under his breath. The first royalty check arrived in April, smaller than the eventual projections but larger than any sum Nora Kessler had ever held in 60 years of careful, frugal living. She did not buy anything extravagant. She paid off the equipment shed note in full 6 months early. She mailed Curtis and Denise each a modest check, with a short note attached. Not an equal 3-way split of the windfall. Not what either of them might once have expected. A fair gift, freely given, on her own terms. No legal pad. No argument attached. Curtis started a savings account for the first time in his adult life. One his wife actually knew about. Denise put her share into Ray's shop too, but honestly this time, with her mother's full knowledge, and for the first time in years, without a shred of shame. Nora did something neither of her children expected too. She set aside part of the second royalty check that June. She drove it herself in cash to a young couple 2 farms over on Miller's Branch Road. The Ashworths. Their barn had burned in a lightning strike back in March. They'd been quietly patching through the spring, without insurance enough to cover the rebuild. She didn't announce it. She didn't wait for thanks. She just handed Wanda Ashworth an envelope at her own kitchen door. She told her Walter would have wanted somebody in this valley to get a lucky break. They didn't have to earn the hard way first. "Why us?" Wanda asked, stunned, the envelope still unopened in her hands. "Because somebody did something like this for me once," Nora said. "A long time ago, when Walter and I were young and struggling, and didn't have 2 nickels to rub together most winters. I never found out who. I've had 40 years to wonder. I decided a while back, if I ever got the chance to be that somebody for another family, I'd take it. Without asking for a name in return either." Foster called in early March with news of his own. Bellwood's parent company had quietly let Deacon Voss go. Investors had started asking questions about the failed Kessler option. Foster mentioned it almost in passing, the way a lawyer mentions something he finds satisfying, but knows better than to gloat over out loud. "I don't take pleasure in a man losing his job," Nora said when Foster told her. "No," Foster agreed, "but I guess you don't lose much sleep over it either." "No," Nora admitted. "I suppose I don't." Patricia Holloway sent a short note that same month, unofficial and handwritten, tucked inside an envelope from the county recorder's office. She'd heard, through channels, a woman in her position tended to hear things through. The filing had already become a quiet legend among the local title attorneys. A cautionary tale told to young associates about the dangers of assuming a plain-looking farmhouse held nothing worth checking twice. Nora kept the note in the kitchen drawer. Alongside the old feed receipt, Bellwood's name still scrawled on the back, 2 small souvenirs of a fall she didn't ever want to forget, even once the fear of it had faded. Earl kept coming by on Thursdays, straight through the winter and into spring, splitting wood that no longer strictly needed splitting, mending fences that held up fine on their own. Some habits are worth keeping, once a friendship settles into them, even after the reason for them has changed. One Thursday in April, over coffee, Earl finally asked her something he'd clearly been turning over since November. "You ever think about what you'll do with the rest of it, once the lease payments really start coming in?" "I've thought about it some," Nora said. "And I want to fix the church roof at the end of the road, the one that's been patched with tarp since the ice storm 3 winters back. I want a real refrigeration unit in the fellowship hall kitchen, the kind that doesn't die every August, and I want to set some aside, quiet, the way Walter always did. For whoever in this valley needs a hand up, nobody else is offering. Earl nodded slowly, unsurprised, the way a man nods when a friend confirms exactly what he already suspected of her character. Your grandmother would have done the same, I expect, if she'd ever known what she was sweeping over. I like to think so, Nora said. I like to think it runs in the blood, whether the money's there to prove it or not. In late April, Denise brought her daughter Callie out to the farm on a Saturday. Just the two of them. Denise dressed it up as helping with the garden. Nora understood, within the first 10 minutes, it was really about something else entirely. Callie was 11, quiet and watchful, the way her grandmother had been at that age. She spent most of the morning trailing Nora around the hen house. Careful questions about eggs and feed, and how you could tell a good layer from a lazy one. Mama says you found treasure in the cellar, Callie said finally, crouching to watch a hen peck at scattered corn. Like a pirate map. Nora laughed, the first real laugh she could remember, in longer than she wanted to admit. Not quite a pirate map, just an old piece of paper your great-grandfather Walter hid there a long time ago, because he wanted to make sure I'd be taken care of. Why'd he hide it instead of just telling you? It was, Nora thought, exactly the question the adults in her family had been too polite or too proud to ask her directly all winter. Because he was scared, I think, of what might happen to it if too many people knew too soon. Sometimes the people who love us most make choices out of fear. They look strange from the outside, but underneath the strangeness, the love is still real. Callie considered that with the particular seriousness of a child working through something larger than her years. I wouldn't hide anything from the people I love, she announced. I'd just tell them. That's a fine way to be, Nora told her. I hope you stay that way as long as you can. It's harder than it sounds, once life gets its hands on you a little. They spent the rest of the afternoon in the garden. Callie's small hands were clumsy but eager in the dirt. When Denise came to collect her that evening, Callie ran ahead to the car, chattering about hens and buried treasure. About a great-grandfather she'd never met but suddenly felt she understood a little better. Denise lingered a moment at the porch steps. Thank you for that, she said. She's been asking about Daddy non-stop since December. I never know what to tell her. I didn't really know him myself, not the way I'm starting to understand now. None of us know our parents all the way through, Nora said. We just get the parts they decide to show us. Maybe a few more if we're patient enough and lucky enough to go looking after they're gone. Were you surprised? Really surprised, I mean, once you understood everything he'd done? Nora thought about that question longer than Denise probably expected her to. No, she said finally. Not surprised that he did it. Surprised maybe at how long he was willing to wait, and how much he was willing to carry alone, just so I'd never have to carry the fear of it myself. That's not a surprise though, so much as it's just Walter. One more time, being exactly who he always was. Foster stopped by the farm himself in early May. An unusual visit for a man who normally preferred his own office. He said he'd been out that way on other business. He wanted to see, with his own eyes, how the recorded parcel had settled into ordinary life. Nora walked him down to the cellar, more out of pride than necessity. She showed him the empty cavity in the wall where the ammunition box had waited 50 years. Your husband would have made a fine lawyer, Foster said, running a hand along the old fieldstone. He understood something most people never learn, that the strongest protection isn't loud, it's quiet and patient, and it waits exactly as long as it needs to. He'd have hated being called a lawyer, Nora said. He always said lawyers complicated things that plain folks could settle with a handshake if the handshake was honest. Foster laughed, a real laugh, the first she'd heard from him. He wasn't entirely wrong about that, though I'd say this particular arrangement worked out rather well for everyone, handshake or not. Before he left, Foster handed her a final folder, the last of the paperwork closing out the formal confirmation. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, something interesting. More inquiries in the past few months about severed mineral rights on old farms than in the previous 10 years combined. Your case got people asking questions, he said, wondering what else might be sitting quiet in their own basements and barns. I'd call that a fitting legacy for a man who spent his whole life making sure the quiet things got looked after properly. He'd have liked that better than the money, I think, Nora said, being useful to people who never even knew his name. Most good men would, Foster agreed. He took his leave, driving back down Cutter's Gap Road the way so many cars had that year. This one at least left nothing but goodwill behind it. In May, with the ridge green again and Bell Creek running high with snowmelt, Nora asked Earl to help her rebuild the cellar wall properly. Real mortar this time. Professional work, but with one addition Walter never thought to include: a small window set into the brickwork at eye level. It let a shaft of afternoon light fall right onto one spot on the dirt floor, the exact spot where the ammunition box had waited 50 years to be found. "Why the window?" Earl asked, mixing mortar in an old bucket. "Walter kept that secret in the dark his whole life," Nora said. "Out of love. He thought that was the only way to protect me. I don't need to keep it dark anymore. I want the light to find it every afternoon, whether anybody's looking or not." Earl nodded slowly, the way he did when something made sense to a man who'd spent his life reading land and the people on it. "Your grandmother swept this floor 60 years and never knew," he said. "Feels right somehow. The next 60 years it gets to see daylight." They finished the wall together that afternoon. Comfortable silence, the way two old friends work when the talking's mostly done already. When the last brick was set, Nora stood back and looked at her work. Small, neat, finally finished. In late May, the county held its annual Founders' Day picnic at the fairgrounds outside Staunton, an event Nora had attended most years of her married life but skipped the past two. First out of grief, then out of the particular exhaustion of a fall spent fighting for what was hers. This year, Earl talked her into going, more or less by showing up at her door in his good shirt and refusing to leave until she agreed. The picnic was much as she remembered it. Long tables of casseroles, children running barefoot through the grass, a local band playing the same 3 gospel songs they'd played every year since Nora was a girl. What was different this year was the number of people who stopped by her table to speak to her directly, neighbours and near strangers alike. Some of them mentioned the mineral rights outright. Most of them just said they were glad to see her out and about looking well. "You're something of a local hero now, whether you asked to be or not," Earl said. He watched a third neighbour walk away, after shaking Nora's hand a little too long. "Folks around here respect somebody who holds steady under pressure, especially somebody who could have made a great deal of noise about it, and chose not to." "I never wanted to be a hero," Nora said. "I just wanted what was mine, and I wanted my children to understand why their father did what he did." "Sometimes those things end up looking the same from the outside," Earl said, "even when they don't feel the same on the inside." Denise's husband Ray approached the table late in the afternoon, a little nervous, the way a son-in-law approaches a mother-in-law. He suspects he's disappointed more than once. He'd brought his own plate over, rather than eating with the group from the shop. He sat down across from Nora without quite meeting her eyes at first. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "for what you did with the books, with Denise back in the winter. I know it wasn't money you handed us, not directly, but it might have saved the shop more than money would have." "Money without sense behind it just delays the same problem, Ray," Nora said. "Your father-in-law taught me that, more times than I probably appreciated, while he was alive to keep teaching it." "I wish I'd known him better," Ray said. "Denise talks about him more now than she did before all this happened. I think losing him made her realise how much she never asked him while she had the chance." "That happens in most families," Nora said. "The asking comes late, if it comes at all. I'm just glad it came at all for the two of you." Ray nodded, looking down at his plate a moment. Then he said the thing he'd apparently come over to say. Plain and unpolished, the way of a man more comfortable with torque wrenches than feelings. "I'm going to do right by her, Mrs. Kessler, and by the shop. I know I let it slide further than I should have before I said anything to anybody." "I believe you," Nora said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she meant it completely. Curtis and Denise came out to the farm together in June, an actual visit, unprompted by any letter or lawyer. Just a Sunday afternoon, the way Sundays used to be, before their father died and everything got complicated by money and grief in equal measure. They brought their families this time. Grandchildren Nora hadn't seen running through her yard in longer than she wanted to admit. She stood on her porch, watching them chase the hens, that fearless joy of children who don't yet understand what any of this cost anybody to arrive at. "It's a good house, Mama," Denise said, standing beside her on the porch, watching her own daughter shriek with laughter over a hen that had gotten the better of her. "I don't know why I never really saw it before. You saw what you needed to see. At the time, Nora said. That's how most people get through the hard years. I don't hold it against you. You could have, though. I could have, Nora agreed. But your father spent his whole life making sure I'd have something worth more than being right about who wronged me. I'd rather use it building something than proving a point nobody needs proved anymore. Curtis found her later that evening, sitting alone on the porch steps while the grandchildren wound down toward bedtime inside. He sat beside her, without saying much, the way his father used to, on evenings when words felt like too much effort for what needed saying. I've been thinking about the coat, he said finally. What coat? Dad's old canvas work coat. The one you patched that first night, after we left with the truck. Sarah found a photo of you wearing it out at the hen house. One I took on my phone, without thinking much of it at the time. I keep looking at it. Why's that? Because I think that coat's the truest thing in this whole family, Curtis said. Worn out, patched more than once. Still doing its job, because somebody cared enough to mend it instead of throwing it away. I used to think inheritance meant getting handed something valuable. Now I think it might mean something closer to that coat. Getting handed something worn and choosing to keep mending it anyway. Nora looked at her son a long moment, in the fading June light. 35 now, steadier than she'd seen him in years. She thought that if Walter could see this evening, this conversation, he might finally allow himself some quiet satisfaction. His 12 years of careful secrecy had done more than protect a piece of paper. It had given his children room to grow back into the people he'd always believed they could be, underneath the fear, the debt, the legal pads. Your father would like that thought, she said. He was fonder of that coat than he ever let on. That evening, Curtis and Denise loaded their families into their cars and drove off down Cutter's Gap Road, taillights disappearing the same way they had that first terrible evening, 9 months before. Nora walked down to the cellar one more time. Alone. The new window cast a long gold rectangle of late June light across the swept dirt floor. She stood there a long moment, the way she'd stood there in November with the lantern. Only now she didn't need the lantern at all. The light did the work on its own. I kept my promise, Walter, she said quietly. I didn't sell the farm, and I never stopped sweeping. She climbed the stairs back up into her kitchen. Coffee was already brewing for tomorrow's early start.